Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our August 10th workshop of the Preccelerator U. My name is Len Lonzi. I am the Managing Director of the Preccelerator program. This is a tech startup accelerator program run by Stubbs, Alderton, and Marklees, a full-service law firm located in Sherman Oaks, California. And today I am excited to have two of my colleagues in the law firm to present. A partner, Caroline Cherkassky, and our senior counsel, Kelly Laffey, are going to dazzle us with everything about term sheets that we need to know as we go into fundraising and how to prepare for that. So without further ado, and without going into too much bio on each of these two wonderful attorneys, I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thanks, Len. I'm Caroline, the co-chair of the VC startup practice, one of the partners here. Kelly and I have done this, I feel like, countless times now, maybe what, 10 or so. So I think, if I recall correctly, it's been a while now with COVID, but we can take questions as we go. I think there's a question function we'd like you to use if there are any questions as we go along. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end. If there's a question that seems very, very specific, maybe save that for later and we can reach out one-on-one. Try and keep questions that are general and would be applicable to a large audience, not for your specific company. And we'll go from there. And
yeah,
Kelly?
we don't have the Q&A function because
we don't have
presentation mode, but just put it in the chat.
There we go.
Yeah.
That's right, that was a different format.
And I'm Kelly Laffey. I'm senior counsel at the firm, and I'm also the vice president and director of business affairs for the Preccelerator, which hopefully you all know about since you're at a Preccelerator event. And happy to be talking about term sheets today. Some of you, I think, might have seen this presentation before, but it will probably still be helpful to you as there's definitely a lot of information that we go through. So with that, we'll get started.
And the content seems to change. We direct a lot of it based on which direction the questions are going, so it may look a little different than the last time. Let's see, I will share my screen to get started. All right. Okay, so our agenda is, we'll cover nature of a term sheet, what it is, convertible notes and safes versus a priced equity round like a Series A, et cetera, key terms for convertible instruments, and then key terms for the priced round.
So first we talk about the nature of a term sheet. This is, a non-binding document in most cases. There's a couple provisions in there that tend to be binding, such as confidentiality, and then there's a no shop, which basically says if you have a signed term sheet with us and we're negotiating definitive documents, you're not going to go out and shop the deal to somebody else and get better terms kind of out from under us while we're putting in resources. The goal of the term sheet is to outline the principal terms, basically the main economic and business terms, because you want to get all of that kind of ironed out on a short form document before you spend a lot of time and money on long form documents. The closing of the transaction and getting that long form document signed is always subject to the investor's due diligence to the extent they want to conduct. Sometimes investors conduct extensive diligence on a company. Sometimes they just want to see your cap table and kind of tie that out. And then also, of course, negotiating the long form documents, which is typically when you'd want to get someone like us involved.
All right. So before we jump into the basic terms of each different type of instrument, let's talk about what the notes versus safes versus equity are. So a key difference is issuing a convertible note, and for a long time, until something called a safe came around, a convertible note was one of the most promising and common ways to raise equity without having to spend too much time and money. It's a promissory note that says this is debt. If you'll pay it back, but if you have an equity round in the meantime, it'll flip into equity. So, and a safe is very similar. It does not mean it's safe. I've had that question a lot of times. It does not mean it's secure. Rather, it's an acronym, simple agreement for future equity. So a safe is kind of like a note, but there's no maturity date and no interest rate. So those two are very, very similar. What they share is that they are, again, they're not actually shares in the company, but the promise of future equity versus an actual equity financing is what you think of like a Series seed financing, Series A, Series B, et cetera. So actual equity, actual shares versus the promise of equity in the future. When to use which, you want to consider size of the raise. Costs for a priced round are typically on the company side can be 25,000 and up, plus you usually pay the investor side fees, so usually double that. How much, so if you're raising 500K, you probably don't want to spend 50K on lawyers. So oftentimes we used to see safes and notes sticking around $1 million or less, but now they've gone to larger rounds. Consider timing. Safes and notes are a lot faster because documents are slimmer. And then lastly, if you have a safe or a note, you don't always know exactly how much of the company as an investor that you're getting. So, and as a company, you don't know exactly how much of the company you're giving up because you don't know how many shares they're getting. So if you want more certainty around your cap structure, there is some certainty provided with actually issuing shares. Should I take this one, Kelly? I think we flipped our slide.
Yeah, I think this one.
Yeah, we got out of order. Okay, so before we get into the details on how a note and a safe function, let's talk about some basic calculations. So on the left, you'll see in the green area here, different terms. These are common things if you're raising money that you should think about and understand. I'm assuming most people in the audience are probably from the company side. That tends to be our audience here, but if you're on the investor side, just consider you're still dealing with the same terms, and most of the same issues will come up, but from the different side of the table. So when a company is selling equity interest in a price round, the basic calculations are pre-money valuation. That means what's the company worth before the investor comes in. So if you say a pre-money is really one of the key terms a company investor negotiate, how much is the entity worth before the investor's money comes in? If the investor wants to own 20% of the company, and they're going to, actually let me use the numbers on the slide here. The company's worth 9 million, and there are 9 million shares outstanding. That means before the investor comes in, each share is worth $1, right? The implied value per share is $1 because we think there are 9 million shares, the company is worth 9 million. If the investor puts in 1 million, that means 1 million new dollars are going in the bank account. So the company then is worth its existing pre-money valuation plus the new money. So it's post-money, post-investment value is 10 million. And then there are, because the investor gets 1 million shares for those $1 million, then there are 10 million shares post-closing, the investor owns 10%. Do we have any questions on that so far in the chat? No, okay.
I'll let you know when there's questions.
Cool, thanks. All right, so this is what we call good dilution. If you own, the owners of the company at 9 million own 100% of the company. But now that the investor comes in, those owners own 90% and the investor owns 10%. They have been diluted, they own less. But in this case, that's what we call good dilution. They are holding a smaller piece of a bigger pie, and they're holding the exact same amount of the company as far as value of their shares. Their shares are still worth 9 million. They own the existing investors, these pre-money investors. Their shares, their 9 million shares are still worth 9 million after the investment, but they now represent 90% of a larger company as opposed to 100% of 90% of a company worth 10 million as opposed to 100% of a company worth 9 million. So when you think about valuation term sheets, pre-money valuation is one of the most important things. We'll talk about some ways that can get manipulated with option plans and the like later on in the discussion, but keep in mind that the valuation, that top line number, is what drives how much of the company the investors take and how much of the company the founders and other holders retain after the investment. And this, again, this is talking about actual share issuances, and we'll get into discussion of notes and safes and how to think about cap valuations and terms like that in notes. But it's important to understand that ultimately every note and safe is intending to flip into a round like this. So these calculations, understanding what the valuation means, are really critical for understanding how much of the company is being issued in a price round.
We do have a question about what's a bad dilution, and I believe we addressed that later on, but maybe you want to touch on that really quickly.
Yeah, I think we do get into it maybe a little bit later, but in case we don't have a lot of detail, bad dilution is when is something called a down round, is one example of that. So the good dilution happens when you issue equity to new investors at a valuation that makes everybody happy, that is higher than at a valuation worth what the company is, so that your ownership before and after for the existing stockholders does not change, right? You own your ownership is worth 9 million. If, for instance, you thought the company, let's say you invest in this round, right? You're the investor in the $1 million investor here. And then the next year, for some reason, the company's valuation tanks and the company raises money at a valuation of 5 million. Suddenly, your equity is worth less because the company is raising money and giving away shares at a valuation of 5 million. And your equity after that 5 million pre-money round is going to be worth less. So that would be bad dilution. You still, and there are reasons companies do down rounds. Oftentimes there's no choice to at that point to do, you either do a down round or you go out of business if a company's in dire straits like that. But that's an example of bad dilution. The last example of dilution would be like something like employee equity, right? Employee equity dilutes everyone because you issue more shares to new employees. But that's also typically considered good as long as it's managed carefully, because you see that as an exchange for value of the person being added to the table and their skills being added to the company.
Yeah, I would just add on the valuation side, a good rule of thumb is like the lower the valuation, the more diluted it's going to be. And so if you do a round at one valuation and then you subsequently do a round at a lower valuation, it will be more dilutive than the prior round, and depending on how much lower will also tell you how much more diluted it will be.
Yeah, like for example, in these calculations here, if that pre-money were instead 100 or instead of 99 million, right? And someone was coming in for 1 million, that investor investing the same amount in a different pre-money would own 1% post-closing as opposed to 10% because the pre-money is so much higher. So it's really a critical piece again for understanding what the ownership split and how that's going to be broken out post-closing.
Right. Okay, so then we get into convertible notes and saves, which is honestly where we're going to spend quite a bit of our time, because a lot of early stage companies are doing convertible notes and saves as a way to get money in the door faster, more cheaply, on a cost-effective basis. The key terms for convertible notes and safe are a valuation cap or capped valuation. This is intended to say, okay, so we're raising $1 million now, but we don't want to do a price round, but we want to make sure that our money goes in at no higher than a $10 million valuation. So we set the valuation cap at $10 million. And then the other key term is the discount, which basically says these are basically two ways to get to the price at which the note or safe will convert in the next round. And the discount just takes a straight discount on whatever is paid in the price round. So say it's $1 per share, like last slide, and you have a 20% discount on your safe, then you're only going to pay 80 cents a share in that next round. You could have a convertible note or safe which has both the valuation cap and the discount, and you get whichever one gives you the most shares, basically whatever gets you to the lowest price.
Yeah, I've had some companies recently where there's been some surprise, or even on the investors have been surprised if they're not sophisticated and haven't encountered this before, where they say, well, if the capped valuation is 100 million and the discount is 20%, I'm going to pay a price of 80 million. And that's not how these work. The idea is to place a ceiling on the price that the note or safe holders are paying. And when you have both, like Kelly said, you get either or. So you'll either pay a 20% discount in that case to the new money, or you'll pay no more than an implied valuation of 100, not one on top of the other. And it is possible to have neither, but usually, unless you have very friendly investors, that's not usually the case.
There's a good question, and I know it's addressed on the next slide. So when you advance the slide, I'll read the question.
All right.
Okay, so somebody is asking, is it true that a valuation cap on a note really does not set a cap on the valuation that you get in a conversion, but rather it's just a formula to calculate the actual valuation? For example, if there are more convertible notes issued after your note, the number of shares on conversion will increase and the original cap will not be accurate.
Great question. So the question asker is correct that ultimately what's in the note or the safe, and again, we use those interchangeably because they are at their core the same besides the maturity date and interest rate components. So the conversion terms are set up, it can be set up the same in both. So for a note and a safe, at their core, the conversion terms are just a formula. It's like a formula written out with words. This will automatically convert into the next round of equity securities issued at a price per share calculated as follows. Then you have the formula written out. So the question boils down to what happens if there are things that happen between the note or safe being issued and the conversion event. And sometimes there aren't. Sometimes a company issues a note or a safe round, in July of, like, might have done it last month, right? And then they might do a priced round in December, and maybe in the interim they had no other activity. And then it's pretty clear that there's no effect on the terms and notes and safes. But oftentimes you'll see companies these days doing 2 or 3 rounds of notes and safes. You'll do one round of notes or safes in 2018, then another one in 2019, and another one in 2021. It used to be that you'd see one round, and then usually thereafter it was like a bridge to a priced round. But now they've been stacking on top of each other a lot, doing multiple iterations. And that's the reason why we saw something called the post-money safe take shape a couple of years ago. So the safe was originally thought up by Y Combinator, the group up in the Bay Area, as an alternative to notes, because they saw that most notes they weren't paying attention to the maturity date. They wanted just to have something with no maturity date that would just convert whenever the next round happened, whether it was 6 months or 3 years. So this is where the cap, the pre-money and post-money question comes into play. If you'll recall the prior, or a couple slides back, we talk about pre-money valuation being 9 million and post-money valuation being 10 million. So if you're talking with investors about a cap on your note, it is very important to understand if it is a pre-money cap or a post-money cap. For a long time, most notes were pre-money caps. That would mean that you'd say, and the formula was written in a way, and you still have to pay attention. It depended on each one. There was not a guaranteed, if your note says it's an $8 million cap, this is how it looks. You have to pay very close attention to what the language says. Like we say at the bottom of the slide here, neither is affirmatively better. There are lots of variations, so pay close attention to what the language says. A post-money cap, now what that means is, let's say in that case, a $10 million post-money cap. If you have a safe with a $1 million safe with a 10 million post-money cap, that means at the moment the safe converts, you would own 10%, because it's saying ignore whatever else is happening. Just take whether there are other instruments converting, everything gets jammed into that calculation, saying, regardless of what else is happening at the company, the safe is $1 million, the post is 10. That means they own, the implied pre-money is 9, and the investor owns 10%. If the cap is pre-money, you include all shares. You can look at the definition here. And again, these can be nuanced and varied, but typically they read this way, that if it's a pre-money cap, you usually take that cap and you divide it by the number of shares outstanding. So again, if it's a $9 million cap and there are 9 million shares, 9 divided by 9 is 1, that's the price per share. If it were 9 million valuation and 4.5 million shares, you have a price per share of 2, 9 divided by 4.5. But the question is, what's in that denominator? How do you get to 9 million shares or 4.5 million shares? And that's the key that's in the conversion language, which is where you have to pay very close attention to the note of the safe. What is in the denominator? The higher the denominator, the lower the price per share for the investor, and the higher percentage of the company the investor gets. So in a typical pre-money structure, you include all outstanding options, all outstanding warrants, founder shares, any equity, but you don't usually include if there are other notes or safes that have been issued, except for maybe ones that are in the same sort of group of notes as your own. So if the company has done one round of notes in 2018 and does another in 2019, in the typical long-standing pre-money structure, those new notes issued in 2019 would dilute the investor in the 2018 notes. So in the post-money structure, which was set up essentially to, by commoners, this was set up for more certainty, which it does provide, but and again, while neither is affirmatively better in all cases, in many cases, the post-money structure is meant to protect investors from the successive, from having multiple rounds of safes issued and notes issued without visibility from their end. So they basically don't want to be, if you're a safe or a note investor, you don't want to be diluted by additional rounds of safes and notes. So that's what the post-money structure was meant to protect against. And it says, if in that denominator, all shares issuable upon any convertible securities get included in the denominator, which means if the company has issued 5 rounds of notes, they all get in that denominator. 9 million is the pre-money. How many shares are in the post-money? The higher the share count, the lower the price, the more of the company the investor gets. So again, neither is better nor worse, but the question is really on point for this slide, which is basically pay attention to the conversion terms and really, model out. We do a lot of modeling in Excel for clients to say, here's what the legal language says and here's what that means. If you raise this note and say you do X, Y, or Z, say you do a Series A in 6 months at this price. So it's really good to model out what the actual implication is. There was an article many years ago, maybe not many, but a few years ago in TechCrunch about how the downside of safes and notes, about how many companies are using them too willingly. And there's nothing really wrong with safes and notes. The problem is that unlike an equity issuance where you clearly calculate at the time of issuance how many shares someone's getting, you don't do that usually in notes and safes. But you can model out, a lot of potential scenarios. And if you do that modeling and you have an understanding of which direction the equity could go and what the possible outcomes are, then they can be used really well. But you should definitely not sign them blindly without modeling what the dilution might look like.
Yeah, and so to further contextualize this a little bit, to bring it a little bit higher, like the whole kind of point of this is to determine how you're getting diluted and who is getting diluted. So from the investor's perspective, they want the post-money safe because they don't necessarily have control over how many more convertible notes and safes the company does. And so they probably want to be protected from additional dilution from safes and notes that have maybe worse terms than theirs, or better terms, excuse me. From the company's perspective, or really the founder's perspective, if it's not diluting the investors, then it's diluting you, because it's definitely not diluting the new money. And so someone, Jeff, who asked the first question, also asked, is it possible to set like a real cap? Is that the post money? The post money gets you to the most kind of definitive that you're going to get, but it also, you don't know what the next round terms are going to be. So there's nothing there's no way to say this will convert into this many shares unless you have literally a set price in the document. Like this will convert at $2 a share. And that would imply some kind of valuation as well. But you just don't know what the company's going to do between the time that you invest in the safe. Maybe they increase their option pool, because there's usually not a prohibition on doing that. And so that would change the price as well.
Yeah, the post-money cap does get the closest you can to certainty around cap, but keep in mind that most of these safes and indeed the Y Combinator forms that most people use have either a cap and discount together, or if you have just a cap, you still have a floor on the price of even if you have a cap, if the new money, let's say it's going to convert into your Series A financing, if your cap is 100 million, well, that's too high for Series A. If your cap is 10 million, but you do a Series A at an $8 million valuation, forget that 10 million, your investors are paying whatever the new money is paying, because your notes aren't going to pay less. So there is always the variable, like Kelly said, of what's the new round actually going to be. And if there's a discount at play, that's the TBD part, right, on the downside. But the post-money does get you the post-money structure, as far as taking into account all different potential new issuances, gets you as close as possible to certainty and valuation for a note and safe. All right.
Then the other key term was the discount, which I sort of mentioned in the summary as well, which basically says what discount you'll get off the new money price. So if you have a 10% discount and the new money is paying $1 per share, you would pay 90 cents per share. So you would get basically more shares for more bang for your buck, as a way of putting it, than the new money investors, because you put money in first and your money was more at risk. Like we said earlier, some notes and safes have both. It doesn't mean you get both, like, oh, you get the discount on top of the valuation cap price. Most often, I mean, I don't think any time I've seen where both apply, it means you get whatever the price is that is less. So you would get the most number of shares. And I do want to just say, I get this question a lot. I haven't gotten it yet in the chat, but I'll just address it right up front. So the biggest thing that people ask me is, how do I set my valuation cap? Because I have no idea what my company is worth. Usually it's, we just started, we have this great idea, we've got this person doing this and this person doing this, and maybe we put together a good team, but we don't have a prototype, we don't have traction, we don't have users, we don't, depends on what kind of company it is, but there's no way to put a number on that. And so how do I set my valuation cap? Well, some investors will require that you do the exercise and say, I think my company is worth $5 million because XYZ. But one thing I have been kind of trying to push a lot of companies towards, to the extent the investors will bear it, is to do a discount only safe for your first money in. Because that way maybe give a healthy discount, because it is a concession to do a discount with no valuation cap. But that way you kick that can down the road and you don't have to kind of come up with a number that might not actually mean anything to anyone.
Absolutely. The discount only safe is super, well, yeah, to be really clear, like the discount only is way better for the company. With the clarification that usually, like Kelly said, if you're giving a discount only without a cap, you often have to give a higher discount as a concession. So there's that variable, but all else equal, as a company, you would always rather have a 10% discount only versus a 10% plus a cap. Because again, one of them is you only get the investor will get whichever is more beneficial. So having both just gives them another option to get something more beneficial. The discount only allows you to let the valuation find itself at your next priced round, and then make sure your note or safe investors who came in early are taken care of, paying a lower price in the form of a discount. Another fun, okay, a little bit mathy again, but liquidation preference overhang. So when you issue stock to investors in a price round, talk a lot about Series A or Series C. Preferred stock has something called liquidation preference. That means in the event of a liquidation or exit of the company, and again, this can vary, but most vanilla California or West Coast VC financings have it structured this way, where the preferred investors get paid 1x their investment amount before the common stockholders get paid. That means that let's say you just did one financing round, it was Series A for $5 million. And you sell your company, and they took half the company. It doesn't make sense logically, but for math purposes, let's say they took half the company. If you then sell your company the next day, the preferred investors don't want to get, and you sell your company for 5 million, then absent a liquidation preference, they would only take half of that 5 million, they get 2.5. So the liquidation preference is meant to make sure that if the company gets sold before the preferred investment has really allowed the company to appreciate in value, the investors get their money back before the common stock, usually founders and employees, get their sharing percentage. Now, if the company has a big exit, West Coast deals are usually structured so that everyone just shares. Like you don't get paid your money back as an investor and then also share. It's called non-participating preferred. We'll get into that a little bit later. But so keep in mind, this liquidation preference means the investors get their money back or have the right to in in the event of like a fire sale. They get paid before the common stockholders get paid. Now, that's usually structured in reference to the price per share paid. Let's say again, it's $1 per share and you had $5 million. That means that each share of Series A preferred stock will get $1 per share back in liquidation preference before anyone gets to share upon an exit. If you, however, had shares issued at a discount, so in the prior slide, let's say you paid 90 cents a share, right? The liquidation preference has to be the same per share for each of the same type of, in the company's charter, it has to be the same type, every type of share. Like each Series A share has to have the same liquidation preference. So you can't say, okay, Series A shares issued to these holders get 90 cents per share, and Series A holders issued to these shares get $1 per share. You have to call them different things if you're going to distinguish. So there are a few different, and you don't want your discount holders who paid in 90 cents to get $1, because then suddenly your $5 million liquidation preference you have to clear before the founders get paid might actually be 6 million or whatever. I haven't done the math on that one, but because the holders are getting more shares on the dollar than the new money, you have to be careful of creating this slightly higher liquidation stack than the actual 1x. So you have two ways of dealing with that. One is to issue in this, oh, someone mute, there we go. One is to issue in this situation of $1 per share, 90 cents a share, these extra 11,000 or so shares, you issue those as common stock. That way they don't bear a liquidation preference, they don't bear special rights. The converting note holders get only $1 per share for their preferred shares, and the rest, their sort of extra shares they got from their discount, are common stock that don't get them any more liquidation preference. The more common way of doing it these days is the same way the SAFE is structured. Actually, the typical Y Combinator SAFE is now structured this way, but you do still see some convertible note structured without this. The more common way with Y Combinator is to say there's a shadow preferred. So maybe your new money gets Series A and your converting SAFE or note holders get A1. And they're identical in all respects, except for the fact that rights that are tied to the amount paid in are varied. So liquidation preference is the key one. That means your liquidation, the amount you have to clear before the common holders get paid, indeed stays tied to 1x and doesn't drift upward. So all that to say, if you're doing a term sheet, if you're using the Y Combinator standard SAFE, this is already taken care of in that form. If you are using a convertible note, have a lawyer look at it, or make sure you dig into it and understand the conversion terms, because what you don't want to do is have a large, let's say you end up with a really large, like a cap that's very far off from your new money. Let's say you have a $10 million cap on your note, but you raise money at 20 million. Like, that's a lot of extra shares going to your note holders. You don't want to have sort of double the liquidation preference that you should have to clear as a founder before you get paid. So pay attention to make sure it's structured in a way that gives the investors liquidation preference only equal to what they pay in. And this is something that gets structured in the note or the SAFE itself. You can't usually go back. You can if they're amenable to, but most times they're not. To ask the investors to change it, you could go back at the time of the preferred financing, but this is something that gets baked into that sort of written formula we talked about around the conversion. So in most notes or SAFEs, there's an automatic conversion section that talks about, here's how the cap gets applied, here's how that denominator we talked about gets calculated, and also what type of shares you get. And that's where this is dealt with, to make sure that they don't get sort of extra rights to more cash back in the event of an exit later.
So some other terms that might come up in the note and SAFE context are listed here. So sometimes you'll have somebody request a side letter to give them participation rights for future rounds, or the right to lead a future round could be a request. They could also request like a board observer right. They might, if they're a really large note or SAFE investor, they might even request a board seat. We don't typically see that. We don't typically advise founders to accept board seats in convertible rounds, but obviously it depends on the dynamics and size of the round. You should also consider, if you're doing multiple closings, what your maximum raise size is. If you are, investing or raising $1 million in a SAFE, but you've got a couple people coming in for 200, 300, 500, 400 at first, and then you're going to round it out later. You just want to be clear and upfront about how much you're raising. And typically in a note, this will be a term in the note. And if you want to raise more, you have to go back and have it amended. The other thing to consider is when it's going to convert. So sometimes you'll see that the note or the SAFE will just convert in any price round. Sometimes you even see it convert for common stock, but most often it has to be a sale of preferred stock for new money. As an investor side, you usually want that round to be like a legitimate round. You want to make sure that the company is getting sufficient capital to do what it needs to do. And so we often see some kind of threshold set for what constitutes a financing that will trigger the automatic conversion. We often set it at $1 million to be kind of friendly to the company, because usually a price round should be more than $1 million at this point, given the cost, but it can be lower or higher than that. For notes, you also have to add maturity date. So when is it going to become due and payable back to the investor if it doesn't convert? There's usually some terms for optional conversion at maturity. So maybe they'll convert into common stock at their election. Part of the reason why the SAFE was invented was because most investors don't really want their money back. They want some multiple on a, they want to wait it out and get way more money. And so that's why the SAFEs don't have a maturity date. It's just, it will convert when it converts. But notes often get extended, or sometimes people elect to convert to common at maturity. And then the last one is actually probably the most important one on this slide, which is the approval required to amend. So again, I mentioned maybe you're doing $1 million raise and you've got 10 people with $100,000. Do you really want to go out to all 10 of those people to amend, like, for example, to increase the size or to extend the time in which you can raise money under that note? Probably not. It would probably be better if you could just go to 6 of those people and you have a majority. So we almost always have that a majority of the outstanding principal can amend, and especially when you have, like, maybe somebody came in for 500 of that million, and then you've got a couple other small people. Like, it's best if you can just go to that guy and one other person, and it's really quick and easy.
Yeah, and some common things we see, like Kelly mentioned, amendments. I don't see a ton of SAFE amendments because they're structured in a way that's usually more one-off. But if you're doing a note, it's usually under a unifying note purchase agreement that says, the company's raising up to X million dollars. Everyone's party to this agreement. Changes require a majority. And common changes are things like maturity date. That oftentimes, if you have a maturity date of 12 months and 12 months rolls around, the company hasn't done a financing, that most note holders don't want to get paid back. They want equity. They did a note financing in order to speed things up, but they don't actually want to get paid back at maturity. So then an amendment might be done to kick out the maturity date. Yeah, just keep an eye on amendment thresholds.
There's a question about, are there any standard or special triggers that would lead to a board seat? The answer is no. I mean, it's a negotiated right. Sometimes an investor will basically say, I'm not investing unless I can sit on the board. It just goes in line with all sort of information rights. They want to sit on the board because they want a seat at the table. They want to know what's going on. They want to look after their investment. And when they actually sit on the board, they also get a right to vote. And depending on how your board is constituted, that could be very significant. They could have a way to sway decision and policy at the company. We typically don't see people getting board seats unless they've invested a pretty substantial portion of the invested capital in the company. Like, if you're a company that is raising $5 million and this person's putting in 4, or maybe all 5 of it, then maybe it's appropriate for that person to get a board seat. But that's usually at the price round stage. And it is a heavily negotiated term in that it matters what the rest of the constitution of the board is too, right? So are there 3 common directors and 1 investor director? Then it's, that's fine. You still control the board. But if they're requiring, 1 common, 1 investor, and 1 independent, well, then you have a little bit less control and insight into what's going to happen.
And the other thing I'll add to that is, keep in mind, you're setting the stage when you grant rights like that for future. So if you give a board seat to someone that invests in a financing, a note or a SAFE financing, your board will usually be either 3 or 5 people post A. So if you grant a board seat to 1 or 2 SAFE investors, suddenly you're going to have, unless you make sure it sunsets at the next equity round, and that's one option that makes it more palatable sometimes, you'll have a problem when you get to your financing round that you can't usually kick someone off if you've promised them a seat. So keep in mind, if you're doing things like participation rights, board observers, or even board of director seats, one thing, if you really feel like you're compelled to do that and want to get the money in, one thing to make it more palatable and have it not screw up later rounds negotiations is to clarify that that right goes away upon the closing of the next equity financing. That way, you can do your board as needed with your Series A financing. Again, like Kelly said, better not to do it at this stage, and it will be pretty atypical at the note and SAFE stage, unless you have something like a really large note round. Maybe you have one investor putting a couple $1 million into a note, but even then it's still less typical at the note and SAFE stage, but it does vary based on size of round and participation. All right, so we are going to pivot now into the equity financing realm, which will sound pretty familiar. A lot of stuff around how do you calculate ownership, option pool implications, and different things that can be done on the term sheet level to affect percentage ownership. But before we pivot there, are there any, you'll have a chance at the end of the presentation, but if there are any questions now around the safes or the notes, it might be good to hit these now if anyone has any.
We answered everything in the chat. So.
Awesome. Okay. So we are now pivoting to equity financing. Again, that's like a Series A, Series Seed. You could call it whatever you want. You could call it Series 1, but usually it goes Seed, A, B, C, D, etc. We talked earlier about basic economics. Pre-money valuation leads to price per share, which leads to your post-closing capitalization when you combine those. This is another example done with similar numbers to before, but this example here on this page is meant to show a really important detail, which is what goes into that denominator again. Pre-money valuation divided by capitalization gives you price per share. You'd think that the capitalization number is very straightforward. How many shares are outstanding? But it also takes into account what's your option pool size. It also takes into account your notes and safes. Are the shares issuable upon, if say you have notes and safes that you issued before you're doing this Series A, are the shares that are going to be issued to your note and safe holders part of that denominator that will then lower the price paid by the new money? Usually these days, yes. Usually investors in a priced round these days want to have what we call a fully baked pre-money. That means the pre-money is a true pre-money, that if you say it's 5 million, that means that it's 5 million and they're putting in 1 million, they'll own 1/6. They don't, everything else that's happening, the convertible note conversion, all that takes place prior to their investment and is baked into the valuation discussion with the investor. So this is top level, usually front page of any term sheet for an equity financing. But before a founder says, I will obviously take the term sheet with the $6 million valuation instead of the one with the $4 million valuation, pay close attention to the option pool refresh, because that is one way that some investors cram a lot of dilution into being borne by the founders as opposed to them. So option pool, your existing option pool, that's usually a pool of shares you've reserved, maybe not yet issued, but they're available for future issuance to your employees, your advisors, et cetera, for incentive comp. The number of shares in that pool, including the ones that have not been allocated yet, are typically in that denominator. That means they're considered outstanding for purposes of the investor, and they're saying that will not dilute them, that will dilute you, the founder. Now there's usually a refresh in connection with a financing. Not always, sometimes you can get away with that one, but a refresh is typically structured to say, let's say your option pool has been depleted. You've issued all or most of it to your existing employees. The investor knows that post-financing, you'll want to be taking the money you just got from your financing, going out and hiring and growing your sales force, et cetera, and also issuing equity comp. The investor does not want you to then have to immediately dilute them by taking more shares to issue to employees. They want to assume those shares are allocated and price their round accordingly. So they will require a refresh of your pool to make sure there is enough in your option pool to cover planned future grants. Usually the rule of thumb is that there should be enough to get you to your next financing, so 12 to 18 months in most cases. And there's often, and so, thinking about what your hires are, how much they need to get. If you're a single founder and you're going to have to bring on a CTO, you probably need a lot of options in your option pool. If you are, if you've done a lot of hires recently and you're just going to have to hire a couple of salespeople, you might not need as big of a refresh. And some investors will just use it as a way to make sure they're protected against future dilution and just say you must have a 20% available pool, which is really high. There used to be a rule of thumb around 15%. That is no longer. Now it tends to be more like 10% is a pretty typical target. You should have around 10% available, 10% of your company, that is. So if you have 10 million shares, there should be about 1 million shares available at the close of your Series A for your employees. But you can see if there's no option pool refresh in this table here, the existing stockholders own 19 million. You have an available pool of 1 million. Your new investors come in for 2 million and they own 28.57%. See here, the investors own the same percentage either way, right? But they have diluted the existing stockholders by requiring an increase to the option pool. That means and look, if that pool is never issued, if the company is sold tomorrow, this increase doesn't make any difference. But in most cases, this pool will eventually be issued and it just dilutes the founders. The investors have essentially future-proofed themselves against being diluted by this pool increase. So you got to pay attention to not just the top line pre-money valuation, but also things around how is the pre-money calculated? Like what's the pool size? What's the target? because there could be you could have a 20% target or a 5% target. It could make a big difference with founder equity.
So we often get asked this question about how much of my company should I give away? What's the typical amount that investors should own after closing an equity price round? So this has varied widely for a while, but it has varied even more widely since COVID started. And it's just all over the map. So I almost don't even want to put this slide in here anymore. But a good ballpark for kind of what's in the the middle probably is that 7 to 15% for seed, and that could be your no round, and then 25 to 35% for the Series A. After the Series A, we still typically see founder control. So the investors collectively own between 40 and 50%. And then the founders and like your early hires, think, the C-suite and the critical hires from the very beginning would still own the majority control, so that they can, still align on the direction of the business. But again, I've seen terms all over the map, especially in the last year. So you can't really like take this to the bank.
Yeah, this is based on some data though, but that does tend to trail behind by a bit. I think the reference to investors owning 40 to 49% was based on a study done, but I think that was from 2019. I don't know if we have 2020 numbers yet, but and I will say that right now the environment's very frothy for companies. I've seen a lot of investors saying they're paying 10%, 20% more than they really should be to get into the companies. So take these numbers, like Kelly said, with a big grain of salt. All right, we'll go through this quickly. These are some of the key, when you do a financing, a Series A financing term sheet, it could be 1 page or it could be 10 pages. It may or may not go into detail. Sometimes you'll see a term sheet that says, standard 1x non-participating preferred. That means that to refresh, we talked about before, liquidation preference means investors get their money back before the common holders get anything. However, it's not, this non-participating here is key. And again, very standard for the West Coast financings, even most East Coast financings these days. Non-participating means that you either get your 1x back or you share pro rata, which means if there's a blockbuster exit, forget the 1x return of funding, everybody's sharing pro rata on there based on the percentage of the company. But if for some reason the company is a fire sale, the investors are protected and can just take their 1x back instead of sharing from a very small portion of cash. Participating means that the investors get their money back off the top and then everyone shares. So, and that's, I still see it. I saw it, a couple months ago, but it's very, very atypical still. A lot of times when you see it, it actually goes back for companies that have been raising money for a long time and someone early on did it, then the next investor wanted it. And there is a snowball effect for these things, because unless you can get one of the early investors to back off and change that later, oftentimes if the A gets it, the B wants it, and then the C wants it. And then suddenly you have this building up over time and just creating a larger and larger liquidation stack that has to be overcome before the common holders can share. And it can backfire on a Series A investor, especially if later the Series B, C, D investors come and they are senior. That means they get paid out in an exit before the A, and they have participating preferred. They will then increase the stack that gets paid out before the A sees money. So it can backfire on an early investor, which is one of the many reasons why we just don't see it anymore very often. So look out for typical 1x non-participating preferred. That's standard, just normal investor protection to make sure they're protected in a fire sale. Non-accruing dividends. I've actually seen this change since the last NVCA docs came out a few months ago, or maybe almost a year ago now. A lot of times you'll see dividends are when companies pay out their earnings. Most startup companies do not pay out dividends because they take their earnings and if they have any and plow them back into growing the business and running at a deficit. But there are protections around dividends that the preferred can be entitled to to make sure that the preferred gets paid. If the company is going to pay common, that they will also pay preferred dividends. They can't send out money to the common without also paying the preferred. And the last sort of economic structure that I'll point out is something called broad base weighted average anti-dilution protection, which is a mouthful. This just means that anti-dilution protection is a term that's meant to protect the preferred from that down round we talked about before. So it does not protect against good dilution. It does not mean that if you own 5% now, you will forever and always own 5%. It means that if you own 5% now that you bought in at a price of $1 and the company later raises money at 50 cents, you get some protection to mitigate the fact that you will now, that your value has gone down. Full ratchet means that you get essentially almost more, you get effectively more shares issued to you as though you had paid 50 cents instead of $1. That is very atypical. Occasionally see it super early stage when there's not a lot of info about valuation and people might be doing a price round before they should be, before they really know what the value of the company is. Usually it is broad-based weighted average, which takes into account the size of the down round, how far off it is, and gives the investor that paid $1 in that case some mitigation. They might get effectively a few extra shares to take the edge off, but they don't get brought down to where the new down round is. So look for broad-based weighted average anti-dilution protection.
Other rights you'll see that come along with a price round are specific voting rights, most commonly veto protections on certain items the company can't do without the approval of the preferred. What that approval is can be negotiated, but it's most often a majority of the outstanding preferred, or if you've got multiple classes of preferred, sometimes you'll have a majority of all outstanding preferred voting together, or maybe you'll have a majority of the Series B, which is the highest preferred, has to approve certain actions, and then other actions require a majority vote of all. So you can kind of slice and dice it a bunch of different ways. But these actions are usually super material actions like selling the company, issuing additional classes of stock, amending the corporate governing documents, paying dividends, repurchasing equity, changing the board, things like that. So it might also include more, I guess, day-to-day matters, such as like, well, how many options can I grant to the CEO, who is likely on the board and maybe is the founder and controls the board? There's usually some kind of protections in there so that there's not kind of that undue dilution effect at the equity level. And on the company side, you just want to make sure that you kind of understand what approvals will be required if and when you have to go do any of these things, because eventually you might want to sell the company. It's not that they don't want you to do it, but it's a matter of what are the terms of that sale? Do they like the buyer? Do they like the price? Usually is the most important thing. And so you want to make sure that you're aligned with those people that you're going to need to have approve it.
All right. Stockholders agreement. Now, this could be in the standard National Venture Capital Association, the NVCA documents. These are a national set of documents publicly available that most practitioners use as a base starting point. There are actually 3 stockholder agreements covering various stockholder rights of the investors: rights to have their shares registered, rights to participate in future offerings, a drag along, which means a certain group of stockholders, if they approve of financing, can drag the rest of them along into a sale of the company. And then a right of first refusal and co-sale, which usually has to do with if a founder or other key holder wants to sell the stock, making sure they have to first offer it to the company and major investors first. And also they allow major investors to co-sale or tag along if they're exiting. So these are things meant to give protections that on the founder side, that the founder's not going to sell out without the investors coming along with them. And on the drag along side, making sure if certain thresholds are met, that everyone will vote in favor of a desirous sale. Oftentimes at the Series Seed stage, before you get to Series A, if you're raising a Series Seed financing, low dollars, and you don't always do the full suite of 3 investor agreements plus there are 5 documents, 3 of which are stockholder agreements in the NVCA suite. So oftentimes those are the base for all financings. I don't think I've done one in the last 10 years that hasn't used those, other than a Series Seed, where we collapse a lot of them into a single document. So you can have 3 documents, you can have 1, you can have 2, but pay attention in the term sheet to the different investor rights and structures that are put in place, and make sure that those are all, discuss those at length with counsel and make sure you're comfortable with what's being put in place. And that all goes back to, they usually go back to control, right? With which Kelly talked about on the slide before, is what's the required vote? That required vote in the veto rights usually carries through to things like drag along transfer restrictions. If you want to waive or change any of these, you'll usually have to get that same group to agree. So just understand who you're getting into business with, and that if you're agreeing to it now, it'll probably change at the next round. So that, and for that reason, some things are not included at the Series seed stage. You might have things like registration rights to make sure your shares are registered on a national exchange. Not usually super relevant at Series seed stage. Very relevant if you get to Series E or Series F, right? So you can usually tailor the documents to be right-sized for the financing.
Thank you for being a very attentive audience. I want to thank Kelly and Caroline for taking time out of their day to do this. We very much appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing you all at the next workshop. All right. Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, everybody.